Denis Davidov was a bold Russian warrior, poet and rebel, a true adventurer who lived for battle and storytelling. He led daring guerrilla raids against Napoleon, changing Russia's military tactics forever. His poetry was wild and full of life, earning praise from great writers like Pushkin. Though his writings were censored, his legacy endured. This memoir, now fully translated into English for the first time, brings his thrilling first-hand stories to life. His battlefield victories, his fearless tactics, and his role in the Napoleonic Wars. A forgotten hero, finally rediscovered. These are his words. Let's begin. The civilian population in the area where Kulnev campaigned did not suffer insults or ruin at the hands of his soldiers. They continued to live in substantially the same way as they had in peacetime. His fame had spread far and wide. When after the conquest of northern Finland, Kulnev arrived in Abo and made his appearance at a ball given by Prince Bagration, all the locals of both sexes rose from their seats. The dancers stopped dancing and came over to express their gratitude for his having preserved order and respected the private property of those in the area of military operations, and to thank him too for favors he had extended to their relatives who had been taken prisoner. I had been an eyewitness to these things, yet what a strange contrast. The soldier who had such compassion for every suffering creature that he would refrain from eating meat for a day or more on hearing the pitiful cries of animals being slaughtered in his camp. This same soldier remained unmoved by the carnage on the battlefield and would fly into a rage at his subordinates when they showed the slightest fault in carrying out their military duties. He would extend them no mercy. Threatening orders, sarcastic reproofs inspired by his caustic and biting wit frequently made it unpleasant, even unbearable to serve under him. Anyone who showed reluctance in battle or who exploited peaceful civilians could expect his severest reprimands and displays of such rage that true friends had to take him aside after his outbursts and restrain him from dealing with the culprits in cruel and inhuman ways. On the other hand, he would show more than ordinary concern for the feeding and well-being of his soldiers, whether in war or peacetime. A soldier's honor and reputation should be impeccable, he would say, and since we have the duty to restrain him from looting, we must see to it that he lacks for nothing, because a hungry stomach has no ears. As a commander of the vanguard, Kulnev was tireless in keeping a sharp eye on the enemy. I do not sleep and rest so that the army can sleep and rest. And it was true. He hardly ever relaxed. He almost literally put on his uniform when the war broke out and would not take it off until peace was concluded. At night, the only thing he removed before falling asleep was his sword, which he placed by the head of the bed. Only if he had returned from a long expedition, having been told that the enemy was far away and inactive, would he agree to bathe and change his underwear. Then he would dress again and spend the night in that fashion, keeping his horse saddled up nearby, just in case. At the first news from the front line of enemy movement, Kulnev would appear with only an adjutant or aide at the spot where a shot had been heard, or where the appearance of enemy troops had been noted. There, on that very spot, he would ascertain with his own eyes if the whole vanguard or only a section of it should be alerted, and if there was any need to awaken and warn the entire army or corps to which the vanguard under his command was assigned. Sometimes he was woken from sleep 7 or 8 times in the course of one night, and since I was in the same tent or bivouac, the patrol riders, not being sure in which corner each of us slept, would sometimes shake and wake me up instead of Kulnev. And for several nights, I was denied any sleep, which was truly intolerable. I have already mentioned the ruthless severity with which Kulnev always dealt with pillage perpetrated by the lower ranks. He was equally harsh when it came to their steadfastness in battle. He was extremely strict with soldiers who dodged enemy bullets and left their post under the pretext of getting a fresh supply of cartridges to replace those that had been spent. To put a stop to this abuse, he detached small commands whose assignment was to carry ammunition from the depot, stay behind the firing line, and keep supplying cartridges to the men who needed them. The same was prescribed for the artillery. Kulnev made sure that skirmishers and artillery personnel did not leave the firing line and move their pieces on the excuse of having run short of ammunition. Those who had fired their last shot were required to stay at their post without firing until the necessary supplies had been brought to them by the commands assigned for this purpose. This was essential in Finland, where most of the fighting involved firearms and took place in wooded or rocky terrain. It was also dictated by the fact that our regiments were full of raw recruits, having lost a lot of regular army men in the battles that took place in Austria and East Prussia. These new men were not accustomed to fighting and would often discard their ammunition after the first few shots, taking advantage of the lack of supervision in a wooded area, and head for the supply depot under the pretext of getting more cartridges. Kulnev's new arrangements put a stop to these wiles of recruits determined to avoid danger, forcing them to be more careful and not to squander their ammunition and to improve their marksmanship. It was among Kulnev's detachments that I first took note of a new way to reinforce the lines of skirmishers. I had long realized the disadvantages of reinforcing them from the rear. It merely overcrowded their ranks to such an extent that they were transformed into a shapeless mob of soldiers, sometimes shooting at one another. Kulnev's reserves were positioned farther back behind the flanks of the skirmishers and not directly to their rear, so that when they fell back before the enemy, the reserves could attack on the flanks. The enemy was no longer able to charge a disorderly line, confronted as they were instead by flank attacks, and were themselves repelled and pursued. I do not know whether this procedure is a fundamental rule in Jaeger formations when on peacetime maneuvers, but in actual fighting in a wooded area, such as Finland, it was extremely valuable. Indeed, it proved decisive in the Durovai victory, which was due to Kulnev's dedication and for which he was decorated with the Order of St. George Third Class at the recommendation of Count Kamenskoy. To complete the portrait of Kulnev, I have resorted to some passages from his various letters and orders. After serving for 10 years in the rank of major, without any hope of promotion, and in his 42nd year, Kulnev had decided to leave the service. He wrote to his brother at the beginning of 1805, "I confess to you that this war will be my last endeavor. I will not let this opportunity pass me by and will serve in it as a true son of the fatherland. Afterwards, I shall retire to our village of Boldiray. I am weary of not seeing any change to my service duties." But then, military fervor got the upper hand, and he hastened to add, "However, war has its advantages and disadvantages as well, and we must put all our trust in the Almighty. For the sake of Russia's honor and glory, as well as to be of help to my family, I will not spare my own skin." That year again, he wrote to the same brother, "I trust you will not forsake our poor mother, and I assure you that for my part, wherever I may be, she will receive 1/3 of my salary. If I am killed, there will be enough horses and household goods of mine to keep her going for 3 years, because these things cost more than 1,000 rubles. This is all I possess and have accumulated over 20 years of service. Goodbye. Give me your blessing to defeat the enemy. I beseech you again not to abandon our dear mother, especially if I am gone." From an order to an officer occupying a post near Vasa in 1808 comes the following: "Even if you have only 2 men left, your honor requires that you keep the enemy in sight at all times and keep me informed. In any case, try to defend the post that was entrusted to you until the last extremity. There is always time to beat a retreat, but seldom to obtain victory." And from another order of that year, "We must banish all kinds of unmanly rumors with a firm spirit. We were not sent here to plow fields. The Tsar has peasants for that purpose. Honor and glory are what we are here to reap. The more numerous the enemy, the more glory there is to gain. You must keep in mind at all times the words I have repeated to you over and over. An honorable death is preferable to a life of dishonor." To his brother that same year he wrote, "Be patient and do not become depressed. Prayer to God and service to the Tsar are never wasted. What service life was less happy than mine? But all has changed, and I am the happiest of mortals with my present fate." He had received the rank of colonel and the Order of St. George Third Class. It is better to be rewarded for real deeds than to be rewarded for nothing special. How can my Vladimir Fourth Class with a military ribbon ever be compared to a Vladimir First Class worn by some court grandee? Order of 9th June 1808. "Be ready to march. Do not allow the men to wander off under any pretext. Fortify them with thick boiled gruel. A lot of supply wagons have arrived. Ask them for all you need and report to me if they cannot satisfy your demands. A well-fed soldier is worth 10 hungry ones. We cannot determine beforehand how far we can march. We will set out on a 25-mile stretch, and we may end up covering 80 miles. In a letter dated 1810 to the Belarusian Hussar Regiment, of which he was the colonel, Kulnev wrote, "Soldiers should be trained as set forth by the commander-in-chief, no more than 3 hours a day, but make sure you know what they will be taught, and question closely the officers in charge to see if they really know their trade. Otherwise, it will not be a lesson, but a torment of an exercise." From an order at the outset of the conquest of the Åland Islands in the Gulf of Finland in 1809, "Be energetic and cheerful on the march. Only old ladies are miserable. As soon as we get to Kumlinge, a shot of vodka, gruel with meat, and a litter of pine branches. A good night." In 1812, while on the Divina, and therefore not far from Lützen, where his brother lived, after their mother had passed away, he wrote to him, "I have not been able to locate my carriage all this time. I have only the uniform which I am wearing, and I have nothing to drink or eat. Please, brother, fetch me a little vodka and a loaf of bread to fortify my guts, because from the beginning of this war I have not had my fill of sleep or food." And to the same, "If I am to fall by the enemy's sword, I will have perished bravely. I consider it a great joy to offer the last drop of my blood while defending my country." Kulnev was as good as his word. A few days after this letter, on 31st July, in the battle near Kliastitsi, a cannonball tore off both his legs. He fell, and ripping the cross of St. George from his neck, threw it to those near him, saying, "Keep it. When the enemy finds my corpse, let them take it for the body of a simple soldier and not pride themselves that they killed a Russian general." Having portrayed Kulnev as he was, with his qualities and faults, I shall end by saying that he was less remarkable for his military spirit and exploits than for his truly Russian feelings and attitudes. We can say with confidence that he was the last genuinely Russian warrior, just as Brutus was the last Roman. Others, no less brave or enterprising or eager for military adventure, and some even more brilliant, fought alongside Kulnev, but their thoughts and feelings owed as much to a foreign sky as they did to Russia. Kulnev was truly our very own, our Russian star, immutable as the pole star. He typified the Russian of that era who would seal all deals, promises, and oaths by adding, "May shame befall me," and who kept his word not for fear of the law, but for fear of the reproach of his own conscience. His unwavering love of throne and country came from the heart. His respectful love for his parents and his good deeds, hidden and mute towards his enemies, were always modest and natural. His memory for us, his contemporaries and service friends, is sacred and everlasting. I return now to the military action. While I was on my way from Helsingfors to Abo, and from Abo through Vasa to Hamle-Karleby, the fortress of Sveaborg surrendered to our arms. The Swedish troops who defended it and constituted 1/7 of the garrison were conveyed as prisoners to Viborg. But about 6,000 Finnish troops were released and sent home with safe conduct papers. This was a mistake that caused us no end of harm during the summer campaign and even during the first retreat of our troops from northern Finland. In the meantime, our commander-in-chief, Count Buxhovden, not taking into account the weakness of our detachments engaged in the north, kept sending them order after order to step up their pursuit and pressure on Klingspor, whose troops became increasingly concentrated as they fell back towards Uleåborg and were further reinforced by troops arriving from Sweden. This situation signaled a setback for us because our whole 21st Division remained at a standstill in Abo and its immediate neighborhood. The troops of the 17th Division, which had surrounded Svartholm and Sveaborg, entered these fortresses for garrison duty, and the reserves that had arrived from Russia were deployed to protect the shores from enemy landings, which lay far in the future. As a result of this situation, the small bunch of troops seeing action in the north was separated from the main army in the south by a gap of over 50 miles of empty land and had no reserve to fall back upon. I do not mean this as a criticism, but just to show the disposition of the troops. On 1st April, Kulnev occupied Kalajoki. On the 3rd, 2 hours before daybreak, he marched off to attack at Iperi at the same moment as the vanguard of the enemy army had taken the offensive against him. Our infantry, consisting of 3 battalions and 6 guns under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Karpenko and Majors Vreda and Konsky, took the main road, while 2 squadrons of hussars and 200 Cossacks under Major Sillery made up our left flank, riding over the ice of the Gulf of Bothnia, not far from shore. Hostilities got underway at sunrise, and musket fire became intense on the main road and the adjoining woods. At that moment, the Swedish dragoons of the Nieland regiment rode from the shore and appeared on the ice to cut off our cavalry, and moved against a small number of Cossacks scattered ahead of them. The Cossack skirmishers pulled back and began to entice the enemy cavalry in their direction began to lose battle order. Seeing this, Kulnev and I galloped together to muster our cavalry, but by that time, it had charged and dispersed the Swedish dragoons. We just had time to enjoy seeing the Cossack lances going to work and our horsemen chasing the enemy over the flat, snowy wastes of the Gulf of Bothnia. It was a marvelous, spectacular sight. Many dragoons had been run through and many captured. But amid this confusion, we caught sight of a group of horsemen surrounded by a crowd of Cossacks who were still putting up resistance. Racing there at full speed, we heard cries in French of, "Kulnev, Kulnev, save our lives!" It was General Levenhelm, adjutant to the King of Sweden, who had just arrived from Stockholm to join the Swedish army and take up the duties of Chief of the General Staff, and his personal adjutant, Captain Klerfeldt, a young man who had visited us the previous day as a messenger under a flag of truce. They had several dragoons with them. Kulnev pushed back the lances directed at them, jumped off his horse, and rushed to embrace the officials, now our prisoners. The Swedish general had been wounded in the throat by a lance, and his blood ran down Kulnev's mustaches and sideburns. Luckily for him, though, it was not as dangerous a wound as we first thought. Our pursuit of the enemy continued to the village of Pigayok. Levenhelm's wound was immediately bandaged by our own surgeon. Afterward, he and his adjutant, encouraged by our welcome and Kulnev's hospitality, were sent under escort to General Rayevsky, who had already left Vasa to come to our assistance. The following day, we proceeded further. We occupied Bregestad almost without opposition, but we met unexpected resistance at Olkyoki, which did not continue for very long. It would have been useless to warn Kulnev about making sure that the vanguard kept an eye open for a possible surprise attack on our detachment. In this respect, he was a byword for vigilance and perseverance. But he needed to be reminded that his confidence that Klingspor would retreat indefinitely might be unfounded, and that the latter was falling back for strategic reasons, in order to link up with the Swedish and Finnish troops near Uleaborg, and not by reason of panic induced by our rash and overstretched pursuit. I took it upon myself to put him straight on this, arguing with him until I was worn out and on the point of quarreling with him. But it was all in vain. He could not see that as the Finnish troops fell back towards Uleaborg, this junction of main roads, all the Finnish troops of the march would eventually converge there. He did not take into account that his detachment and that of General Rayevsky, cut off from our main forces and trapped on the northern shore of the Gulf of Finland, were advancing towards the same center without support or hope of reinforcement by fresh troops. Giving no thought for all of this, he kept going without looking back, carried along on the cloud of his previous successes. On the 6th of April, our detachment ran into the enemy again. It was near the Siganok church. They occupied a position that they appeared unlikely to give up without a fight. We attacked them fiercely. Our initial engagements were successful, and the Finnish rearguard seemed ready to fall back from their position and join up with the main forces who were retreating. But suddenly, Klingspor had a change of heart. He halted the retreat and sent back half of his army to support the rearguard. The fire was renewed with the greatest fury. The Finnish troops, supported by 10 of their cannons, arranged themselves in columns, lowered their bayonets, and charged at us. Our forces, encouraged by Kulnev's thus far uninterrupted successes and in good spirits, greeted the enemy in grand style. Gunfire gave way to slaughter by cold steel. The Finns and the Swedes were worthy opponents in this kind of combat. The contest was bravely conducted, but the superior numbers of the enemy turned the tables and brought them victory that day. We yielded the field of battle. Losses on both sides exceeded 1,000 men. We lost Major Konsky of the 24th Yaga Regiment. On the enemy's side, Colonel Fleming was killed. Kulnev was saved by divine providence. A cannonball came so close to him that it burned his leg. On the following day, Klingspor quit the battlefield and concentrated his forces between Limingo and Lumioki. We immediately fell back on Siganoki. In the meantime, Rayevsky kept marching in our wake and stopped at Pivayoki, where he joined up with the 5th Division, which came from Kuopio but comprised no more than 3,000 men. One of the brigades, with 2,000 men, was left on the road leading from Kuopio to Uleåborg to pursue the enemy brigade of Kronstedt, which was heading that way. Lieutenant General Tuchkov was in charge of the 5th Division, and because he was senior to Rayevsky, he assumed command over all the troops engaged in northern Finland, who did not exceed 7,000 men in total. Kulnev, who had been punished at Siganoki for his lack of foresight, became more reasonable. We remained there, observing the utmost military caution, but not undertaking any armed action, and awaiting the arrival of Bularoy, who had been directed by Tuchkov to leave the Kuopioki highway and head for Revolax, a village about 7 miles away. But because Kulnev could not remain inactive for long, he sent me on the 12th of April with a squadron of hussars and 100 Cossacks to the island of Karlo. This island is 10 miles from the shore, almost opposite Uleåborg. I was instructed to rid the place of its occupants, but to do nothing except attract the attention of the enemy vanguard. The island was situated on their flank and almost behind their position. I got there at daybreak and found only a few foragers with a small escort. The fighting did not last very long. We beat down a few horsemen and took some prisoners, while the others fled for safety as soon as they spotted us coming. During the course of the day, I returned safely to the unit from which I had been sent. On the same day, 12th April, Bulatov entered Revolax, and at about the same time, Tuchkov and Rayevsky moved towards Bregestad. The enemy army stayed put at Limingo and Lumioki. Their combined forces now numbered 14,000 men. We expected a quick resolution of the conflict, and not in our favor, because our main forces were so far away, and we were now outnumbered by about 2 to 1. On 15th April, that is exactly what happened. That concludes the 8th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content.